They told me I didn't deserve his ashes. My own daughter looked straight at me, her jaw trembling not from grief, but from anger, and said the words like a verdict. Dad's ashes stay with me. You don't deserve them. It wasn't shouted. It was pronounced, slow, deliberate, like she'd rehearsed it in her head until it sounded like truth. That was the day I understood how deep the distance between us had grown, a distance so quiet and so steady that by the time I noticed it, it had already become permanent. I am 81 years old. I live now in a small rented house on the edge of Santa Fe, where the nights smell of creosote and rain, and where silence is a companion that neither comforts nor wounds. But that moment in her kitchen, surrounded by half-empty wine glasses and the ghost of a man who had just been turned to dust, still echoes every morning when I wake. She called me you, like a stranger. I suppose I had been a stranger to her for years. Grief can sharpen what was already cruel. It can polish contempt until it gleams. I remember she wouldn't let me touch the urn. It sat on the counter between us, wrapped in a velvet bag, more honored than I was. She didn't even look at me when she said, "He told me everything." I wanted to ask what everything meant, but the tone of her voice told me that the story had already been written, and I was only the villain occupying its last paragraph. So I just nodded, because old habits die slower than love. The strange thing about age is that the past begins to fold over itself like worn linen. You start remembering the smell of soup before the argument that followed it, the sound of laughter before the years of silence. When I think of Richard, my husband, her father, I don't see the man who sat motionless in his recliner for the last decade of our marriage, staring at the television with the volume too low to hear. I see him as he was at 30, broad-shouldered, impatient, full of impossible plans. We met in a library during a thunderstorm. He offered me his umbrella, and I thought that meant something about shelter. It did, for a while. Then it meant something about control. Still, for years we stayed, because staying felt like virtue and leaving felt like failure. Claire was born into that equation, into the narrow corridor between politeness and quiet despair. I suppose I didn't notice how much she adored her father, how much she believed his version of the world. He was charming even in decay, that kind of man who could neglect you and make you thank him for it. When he grew sick, she was the one who took him to appointments, who managed the medication, who listened when he reminisced selectively. I didn't interfere. He didn't want me near. I cooked, I cleaned, I paid the bills, I waited. That's what marriage had trained me to do, wait. By the end, she had rewritten our family history around her devotion to him, and my quietness became cruelty, my distance became sin. After the funeral, the house smelled of lilies and smoke. People said the usual things. He was a good man. He loved you so much. What a long life together. None of them knew that long doesn't mean happy. None of them knew that the night before he died, he held my hand for the first time in years and whispered, "I'm sorry." Not because he loved me, but because he finally saw how little love costs when it's too late to give. Claire didn't hear that. She was in the kitchen making tea, believing she was the only one he trusted. When I told her later, she shook her head. He wouldn't say that. As if her father's words belonged to her, not to the air between us. It's funny what people choose to inherit. Some want jewelry or houses. Others want the story that flatters them most. My daughter inherited his resentment and polished it into a legacy. She told the neighbors that I'd been cold, that I'd never forgiven him for the affair he had in the 1980s, as though forgiveness were a public performance she was entitled to watch. Maybe she needed to make me monstrous so she could survive loving him. Maybe she just needed someone to blame for the parts of herself that frightened her. I've had decades to consider it. The older you get, the more you see that cruelty often starts as fear dressed in conviction. I didn't argue with her. I didn't beg for a handful of ash. I just stood there, watching the way sunlight hit the kitchen tiles, thinking how ridiculous it was that we were fighting over dust. But grief isn't logical. It's territorial. She wanted possession of him, his remains, his memory, his myth, and she wanted me erased from it. So I let her win that battle. I left her house with nothing but the scarf he once bought me at a gas station on our way to Tucson. The wind outside was cold enough to sting, but I felt lighter, almost relieved. There's a strange peace in realizing you have finally been written out of a story that no longer needs you. The following weeks blurred into a pattern of quiet rituals. I returned to Santa Fe, to the house I'd rented after the hospital bills swallowed what was left of our savings. Each morning, I brewed coffee in the old enamel pot that had outlived 2 marriages and 1 war, and I watched the mountains blush pink with sunrise. I thought about calling Claire. Then I thought about all the times I had called before, and she'd answered distractedly, always in a rush, always somewhere between errands and irritations. "Can we talk later, Mom?" Later never arrived. It rarely does. I filled the silence with small acts of order, watering the rosemary, polishing the old clock that hadn't ticked in years, arranging photographs I no longer wanted to remember. People think loneliness is an emptiness, but really it's an overflow of thoughts, of ghosts, of unfinished sentences. Every object in my house had something to say. The scarf smelled faintly of cedar and regret. His old fountain pen still worked. The last grocery list he wrote, milk, aspirin, rye bread, lay folded inside a cookbook we'd stopped using when he lost his appetite. I couldn't throw any of it away. Not yet. Then came the letter from the lawyer, heavy paper with my name printed too carefully, the kind of formality that announces consequence. I placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. I already knew what it meant. Richard had been meticulous in the final months, meeting quietly with notaries, making arrangements I was not invited to discuss. Claire assumed she was the executor, the keeper of order, the dutiful daughter. I assumed nothing. I had learned that expectation is the root of humiliation. Still, when I read the invitation to attend the formal reading of his will, I felt the faint tremor of something I hadn't known in years. Curiosity, maybe even dread disguised as curiosity. It wasn't about money. We'd never had much. It was about what words he'd leave behind, what version of our life he'd choose to make official. A will isn't just legal, it's narrative. It's the final edit of a life, the closing argument. And I had lived long enough to know that even the dead love to have the last word. So I pressed the letter flat against the table, smoothed its creases, and whispered to the empty room, "All right, Richard, let's see what story you're telling now." Outside, the desert wind rattled the windows, and a small cloud of dust lifted from the sill. I watched it drift in the light, shapeless and free, and wondered whose ashes it might be. I sat in the lawyer's office, surrounded by the faint scent of old paper and lemon polish, waiting for my daughter to arrive. The letter had said 10 o'clock sharp, but the lawyer, Mr. Harlan, a man with a face as pale and smooth as the envelopes he handled, had warned me that family dynamics can delay punctuality. I thought that was a delicate way of saying grief makes people late. Yet Claire wasn't late because of grief. She was late because she wanted me to wait. That had become her way of reclaiming power, a kind of silent choreography she'd learned from her father, how to make absence feel like authority. I'd watched it all my life. The tick of the clock in that office wasn't just marking time, it was measuring distance. When she finally entered, she didn't greet me. She nodded to the lawyer, placed her handbag neatly on the table, and sat opposite me as if I were a client she needed to impress, not a mother she used to crawl into bed with after thunderstorms. Her perfume was expensive, sharp, a citrus scent that didn't suit her, but suited the woman she wanted to be. Efficient, composed, above reproach. Her voice, when she spoke, carried that same crispness. "I'm ready to begin," she said. Mr. Harlan adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading from the thick folder before him. There was something almost theatrical in the way he unfolded the document, like an actor lifting a script whose lines had been rehearsed too long. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Everett Lang, dated February 3rd, 2 years ago." I felt my breath hitch at the date. 2 years ago meant he'd written it quietly, without discussion, while still lucid, long before the hospital stays and the morphine haze. Claire didn't seem to notice. She was already poised with a pen, as if there were notes to take, corrections to make. The lawyer continued in that patient monotone that people in his profession must cultivate to shield themselves from emotion. He spoke of debts, minor possessions, bank accounts, insurance policies, mundane details that passed through the room like a slow wind. Claire leaned forward slightly when he mentioned the house. I saw her shoulders relax, the kind of reflex people have when they expect confirmation of what they already believe. "To my beloved daughter Claire," Mr. Harlan read, "I leave the collection of first edition novels and the silver pocket watch belonging to my father." Her smile flickered politely, already half bored. Then he paused, adjusted a page, and looked up at me. "The remainder of the estate, including all financial accounts, property, and any residual assets, are hereby left to my wife, Mary Ann Lang." For a moment, the air in the room seemed to flatten, as if someone had quietly opened a door to a vacuum. Claire blinked, her pen halting midair. "That can't be right," she said. The lawyer didn't look surprised. He'd seen this before, I was sure. Families splitting open like fruit under a knife. "I assure you, Mrs. Lang," he said gently, "these are your father's express wishes." "My father," she corrected sharply, "would never leave everything to her." The word her fell like an insult. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my wedding ring glinting dully in the light. Mr. Harlan, in his neutral way, slid a copy across the table. "It's all in his handwriting. He signed it in my presence." Claire snatched the paper, scanning as if sheer will could change the ink. Her voice rose. "He must have been confused. You know he wasn't well." The lawyer's expression did not waver. "When this document was signed, he was medically and legally sound." She turned to me then, her eyes bright with something that wasn't just shock. It was betrayal, but of what kind I couldn't yet tell. "Did you make him do this? Did you guilt him into it?" I almost laughed, not from amusement but from disbelief. "Claire," I said quietly, "I didn't even know he'd written a will." She pushed back her chair, the metal scraping the tile with a sound that made even Mr. Harlan flinch. "This is absurd. He told me he wanted me to handle everything. He said he couldn't rely on you." Her words hung there, trembling with the weight of their own righteousness. The lawyer, still polite, said only, "If you wish to contest it, you may do so, but the burden of proof—" "I'm not listening to this," she interrupted. She turned toward the window, one hand pressed to her forehead, as if the sunlight itself had betrayed her too. I watched her shoulders shake, not with tears, but with the kind of anger that comes from seeing the world refuse to align with your story. For a fleeting second, I saw her not as the adult who had banished me from grief, but as the small girl who used to stand between Richard and me when we argued, shouting, "Stop it," like a tiny referee trying to protect what she didn't understand. That child was still inside her somewhere, wounded, defensive, and I wondered if all this fury was simply that child still begging for control over chaos. But then she turned back to me, and the softness vanished. "You don't deserve this," she said again, almost whispering now. "You didn't love him." I wanted to tell her that love isn't always gentle, that sometimes it's just endurance wearing a patient face. I wanted to tell her that marriage is not a photograph of happy people, but a long, uneven film full of cuts and reshoots, and that her father and I had both failed and forgiven each other more times than she could count. But I said none of it. I simply met her gaze and said, apparently, he disagreed. That was when she began to cry, not quietly, not decorously, but in sudden shuddering gasps that startled even herself. The sound filled the room, unpolished and raw, as if grief had finally found a crack in her composure. I didn't move to comfort her. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Some moments must burn through alone. Mr. Harlan handed her a tissue, his professionalism flickering toward compassion. She wiped her face quickly, regaining her control, and said, "I'll be contesting this." The lawyer nodded. "You have that right." When she left, she didn't look at me. The door shut softly behind her, and for a long time I sat there, listening to the echo fade down the hallway. Mr. Harlan cleared his throat again. "Mrs. Lang," he said, "I understand this may be difficult." "For her," I said, "not for me." He hesitated. "Your husband left a letter with the documents, for you only." He reached into the folder and pulled out a single sealed envelope. My name was written in Richard's handwriting, the one that had grown shakier but still deliberate. I stared at it, afraid to open it, afraid not to. Mr. Harlan offered to leave the room, but I shook my head. "It's fine," I said. The paper tore more easily than I expected. Inside, a single sheet of lined stationery, just one sentence in blue ink. "You stayed even when I disappeared." I read it twice, 3 times, until the words blurred. There was no apology, no declaration of love, just acknowledgement. But sometimes acknowledgement is the rarest gift. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into my purse. When I stood to leave, the chair's legs scraped softly across the floor, the opposite of Claire's earlier violence. The lawyer walked me to the door. "He spoke very fondly of you in the end," he said gently. "He said you were the only one who didn't turn him into a saint." That made me smile. Tired, sad, but real. "He wasn't one," I said, "and I'm glad he finally knew it." Outside, the air was bright and thin, the kind of desert morning that looks gentle but cuts your throat if you breathe too deeply. I stood on the sidewalk, letter in my purse, sunlight in my eyes, and thought about what it means to win something you never asked for. Power, inheritance, closure. They all feel the same at first. Heavy, undeserved, inevitable. Across the street, a woman about my age was helping her grandson tie his shoe, her hand steady, patient. For a moment, I envied her the simplicity of that gesture, the uncomplicated continuity. Then I realized envy was a habit too, one I could finally set down. I began walking toward the bus stop, the letter pressing lightly against my hip, as though Richard himself were reminding me that some debts can only be paid in silence. Behind me, the office door closed again. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in that room that belonged to me, except the truth, and that at last was mine to keep. That evening, when I returned home from the lawyer's office, the desert had already slipped into that muted twilight that turns everything a shade between gold and grief. I sat in the car for a long while before going inside, watching the sky bruise into indigo, feeling the slow pulse of the day settle into my chest. The house, when I finally opened the door, smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil. It was too clean, too still. Sometimes silence is a comfort. Other times it's a mirror that shows you exactly how alone you've become. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and set the envelope from the lawyer beside it. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening for news. For the first time in years, I turned on the radio. Classical, low volume, a violin piece that hovered in the background like a thought I couldn't finish. I tried to eat, but couldn't. My hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from an agitation that had nowhere to go. The letter from Richard was still folded neatly in my bag. I took it out again, held it to the light. You stayed even when I disappeared. The sentence was so simple that it almost mocked me. It didn't undo anything. It didn't heal. It didn't even explain. But it confirmed what I had always known and what Claire refused to see, that love, in its quietest form, is not measured by smiles or shared holidays, but by endurance, by the stubborn act of presence when everything else collapses. I placed the letter in the drawer beside the stove, where I used to keep recipes I no longer cook, as if it were another forgotten ingredient that no longer belonged to daily life. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Sleep had been a thin, nervous thing, filled with fragments of memory. Richard laughing in the backyard, while Claire toddled across the grass, the scent of rain on his jacket the night he came home late from the office, the sound of him coughing in the hospital room, where we both pretended he wasn't dying. I made coffee, strong and bitter, and drank it standing at the sink. The mirror over the window caught my reflection. For a moment, I saw my mother's face staring back, stern and unyielding. She used to say that a woman's strength is often mistaken for cruelty. I finally understood what she meant. At 9, the phone began to ring. I knew it would. Claire always acted quickly when her control was threatened. I let it ring until the sound became absurd, then picked it up. Her voice was tight, metallic, like a cable pulled too hard. I spoke to Mr. Harlan, she said without greeting. He told me everything. I waited. I just want you to know, she continued, that this isn't over. You've manipulated him somehow. You've always been manipulative. He probably pitied you. I could hear her breathing, rapid and sharp. I said, Claire, I didn't know about the will. I didn't ask for it. Of course you didn't ask, she snapped. You never have to ask. Things just fall into your lap. He saw through me at the end because of you. I wanted to tell her that no one saw through anyone, that her father had simply run out of energy for maintaining illusions, but I realized she wasn't listening for truth. She was listening for confession, so I said nothing. After a pause, she added, I'm keeping his ashes. Don't even think about asking for them. Then the line went dead. I held the receiver for a moment longer, listening to the emptiness humming through it. It was strange, the relief I felt. At least her anger meant she was still connected to me in some way. Indifference would have been worse. I placed the phone down gently, as though it were a fragile thing, and went outside. The day was unusually still. Even the desert seemed to be holding its breath. I walked to the back of the property where the land dipped into a small arroyo. When we first moved here after Richard's retirement, he'd wanted to build a deck overlooking it, but he never got around to it. Now the arroyo was dry, cracked like old porcelain, the grass brittle beneath my shoes. I stood there for a while, staring at the horizon, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to stop defending myself, what it would mean to live without being misunderstood. The thought was so foreign that I almost laughed. Over the next week, the world closed in around me in small, subtle ways. A neighbor I used to chat with at the mailbox began to wave from a distance instead. The mailman, who once lingered to ask about my garden, now dropped the letters quickly and hurried off. I realized Claire had been calling people, telling her version. In her story, I was the cold widow who'd taken advantage of a dying man, the distant mother who'd never learned affection. It spread the way gossip does, politely and efficiently. No one accused me outright, but the air carried the weight of presumption. At the grocery store, the woman at the bakery counter smiled too sweetly and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss," with a tone that suggested she'd heard there was more to the story. I thanked her anyway. There's a special kind of discipline in not correcting people. Inside the house, I began to move differently. I found myself cleaning drawers that didn't need cleaning, rearranging shelves, sorting through boxes in the closet. It wasn't restlessness, it was reclamation. For years, I'd lived in spaces that were only half mine, corners filled with someone else's preferences, silence dictated by someone else's moods. Now, with Richard gone and Claire hostile, the house had become entirely mine, even if the world outside had begun to shrink. Every object seemed to hum faintly with memory, as though the past refused to leave until I acknowledged it properly. I found a box of old letters from our early years, Richard's handwriting exuberant, almost boyish. One of them ended with, "You make the world tolerable." I read it twice, then placed it back in the box, unsure whether to believe it anymore. Claire continued to call, not daily, but often enough to keep the wound open. Sometimes she would start calm, asking about bills or paperwork, then inevitably shift into accusation. "You don't even sound sad," she said once. "It's like you're relieved he's gone." I answered, "I'm not relieved he's gone. I'm relieved it's over." She didn't understand the difference, or didn't want to. Her voice hardened. He deserved better. I told her, so did I. That was the first time I heard her truly silent on the line. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but in it I felt decades unravel. At night, I began to dream of water, rivers that never reached the sea, floods that swept away furniture but left photographs untouched. I woke up damp with sweat, unable to tell whether I'd been drowning or saved. The dreams left me exhausted but alert, as if some buried part of me was clawing toward daylight. I started walking again, every morning before the heat rose, following the dirt road that curved behind the hills. The desert in early light is mercilessly honest. It shows you everything you've avoided seeing. The rocks, the dry brush, the brittle bones of small animals. It's all there, unapologetic. I found comfort in that honesty. One morning, about 2 weeks after the reading of the will, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tentative. Inside was a single line. "I'm sorry she's hurting you. She doesn't see it." There was no signature, but I knew. It was from Claire's son, my grandson Thomas. He was 18 now, distant, kind, a boy who had inherited his father's quietness, but not his cynicism. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. The letter felt like a hand reaching through smoke. I folded it carefully and placed it next to Richard's in the drawer. 2 acknowledgments, one from the dead, one from the living. For the first time in years, I felt seen. But guilt is a stubborn tenant. Even as I began to breathe more freely, I caught myself rehearsing conversations in my head, explaining, justifying, begging invisible juries to understand that I hadn't stolen anything, that love can decay and still be real. Then I realized I didn't owe explanations to anyone. The freedom of that thought startled me. It was like discovering an unlocked door in a house you thought you were trapped in. Still, freedom is frightening when you've spent a lifetime in caution. By the third week, Claire stopped calling. Instead, she sent emails, long, precise messages full of passive accusations disguised as concern. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I know this must be difficult for you, having to manage everything. Dad trusted you, even when you didn't deserve it. There was always that sting at the end, the subtle twist of the knife. I stopped replying. Her words no longer required an audience. I began volunteering twice a week at the local library, shelving books in the quiet back rooms where the air smelled of dust and ink. The librarian, a woman named Evelyn with silver hair and calm eyes, never asked about my family. She treated me like a person, not a story, and that was enough. Sometimes, when I returned a stack of novels to their places, I'd pause by the philosophy section where Richard's old favorites stood. Camus, Kierkegaard, the thinkers he'd quoted, but never lived by. I'd run a finger along the spines and think, you can't reason your way through love any more than you can reason your way through grief. Each day, the world grew quieter, but also clearer. The people who had pulled away stayed gone. The phone stopped ringing. Even the gossip died, replaced by polite absence. I had become invisible again, but this time I didn't mind. There's a strange dignity in obscurity when it's chosen. Yet underneath that calm surface, something restless stirred, a faint, persistent awareness that the story wasn't finished. Claire's silence wasn't peace, it was preparation. I could feel it like static in the air. I didn't know what shape it would take, but I knew her need for control would not end here. Families like ours don't dissolve neatly. They corrode slowly, quietly, beautifully, like silver left too long in a drawer. The morning I decided to go back to the lawyer's office, the wind carried the smell of rain that never came. The desert had that strange tension it gets before a storm, the kind of silence that feels like someone holding their breath. I hadn't planned to go anywhere. For days I'd been moving through the house like a shadow, rearranging books, pretending to clean things that didn't need cleaning, trying to find purpose in the repetition of small motions. But that morning, something shifted in the air around me, a low, persistent hum of unfinished business that made it impossible to sit still. I dressed slowly, choosing the blue dress Richard once said made me look like the sky over Taos. It no longer fit the same. Age softens the body in ways fabric can't forgive. Still, it felt like armor. The drive into town was long and uneventful. A line of crows followed me for several miles, hopping from fence post to fence post, as if escorting me. The absurdity of that made me smile. I parked in front of Harlan and Ames Legal Associates, a squat beige building that pretended to be more important than it was, and sat in the car for a few minutes, wondering if this was pride or closure. When I finally went inside, the receptionist, young, efficient, kind in the way that youth allows, looked startled to see me. "Mrs. Lang," she said, "Mr. Harlan isn't expecting you." "That's all right," I told her. "Neither am I." He came out a few minutes later, that same bland professionalism masking something almost like curiosity. "Is there an issue with the will?" he asked. "Not with the will. I said, with what comes after. He gestured toward his office, and I followed. The blinds were half open, letting in harsh sunlight that flattened everything it touched. I sat in the same chair I'd sat in weeks before, the memory of Claire's voice still lingering in the walls. I could almost hear her saying, "You don't deserve him." Mr. Harlan folded his hands. "You don't need to come here, you know," he said gently. "Everything is settled." "Nothing is ever settled," I said. "It's just moved to a quieter drawer." He gave a small smile, the kind professionals use when they can't tell if you're joking. "I was wondering," I continued, "if my husband left any notes, anything beyond the letter." He hesitated, then pulled open a drawer, flipping through a file. "There was one other document," he said after a pause. "It wasn't addressed to you specifically, more like a reflection." He handed me a photocopy of a handwritten page. It was in Richard's unmistakable script, uneven but deliberate. The top line read, "For whoever finds this, perhaps it's her." My heart tightened. I read in silence while Harlan pretended not to watch. The letter wasn't long. Richard had written about the house, about regrets that sounded like half apologies, about the ways we had both endured each other. The last line stopped me cold. "Love is not fairness. It's endurance without applause." I traced the words with my finger, feeling the faint ache of recognition. "Would you like to keep it?" Harlan asked. I nodded. "When I stood," he said, "your husband was very clear about his intentions. He didn't want anyone rewriting the story after he was gone." "Everyone rewrites the story," I said. "That's what survival is." Outside, the light had shifted. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and hesitant. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through town until I found myself in front of a small cafe I hadn't visited in years. It used to be a bookstore. I parked and went inside. The smell of coffee and warm bread wrapped around me, and for a moment I felt something close to comfort. A woman behind the counter, about my age, greeted me with a nod. "You look like someone who needs a strong cup," she said, "and maybe a quiet corner." I smiled. "You read minds?" "No," she said, "just faces." I took a seat by the window and watched the rain gather into small rivers along the sidewalk. The cafe filled slowly with the low hum of conversation, people leaning close, laughing softly, the world going on as if no one had ever broken a promise. I opened my purse and reread Richard's note. The ink had smudged slightly at the edges, like something touched by tears that hadn't fallen. Endurance without applause. It wasn't affection, but it was recognition, and for reasons I couldn't name, that mattered more. I'd spent half my life trying to be understood by a man who never quite saw me, and now, when it no longer made any difference, he finally had. It was cruel, the way understanding always arrives late. The rain intensified. A couple entered, dripping and laughing. They reminded me of Richard and me before we became careful. There was a time when he used to make me laugh just by raising an eyebrow, when our arguments ended with laughter instead of silence. Memory is selective that way. It edits kindness to make the pain more bearable. I watched the couple order soup and share a napkin, and for a strange moment I felt something tender, almost like forgiveness. Not of him, of myself, for having stayed so long believing that love meant staying no matter what it cost. I stayed in that cafe until the rain passed. When I stepped outside, the world felt rinsed, raw but new. The scent of wet asphalt mixed with sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like an old man clearing his throat. I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I took the long road that wound past the cemetery. The gates were open, the ground slick and dark. I parked outside and walked in. my shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. Richard's grave was still unmarked. Claire had promised to arrange the headstone. I hadn't asked about it since. Now, standing there, I realized she probably never would. I didn't kneel. I didn't speak. I just stood and let the wind pull strands of hair from my face. The air was thick with that smell of wet dust that always follows desert rain. "You got the last word," I said finally, half under my breath. "Congratulations." My voice didn't sound bitter, just tired. "You were right, Richard. I stayed, even when there was nothing left to stay for." For a moment, I thought I felt something shift in the air, not a sign, not a haunting, just the faint release of a truth finally spoken aloud. I turned to leave, but before I did, I noticed something small near the headstone, a smooth white pebble, almost perfectly round, placed deliberately. I knew instantly who had left it. Claire. She had been here. Despite everything, she still came. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain started again, a soft tapping against the windows that sounded almost like whispering. I sat in the kitchen with a blanket over my shoulders, reading and rereading the note. It no longer felt like a message from Richard. It felt like permission. For years, my life had been shaped by reaction, reacting to his moods, to his silences, to my daughter's judgments, always responding, never initiating. That night, I realized I didn't have to wait for anyone else to set the terms. The inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was the right to define my own quiet. The next morning, I withdrew a small sum from the account Richard had left me and went back to the cafe. The woman behind the counter recognized me. "Back again?" she asked. "I'm thinking of making this a habit," I said. She laughed and poured me coffee. I noticed a small "Help Wanted" sign taped to the register. Without thinking, I asked, "Are you still hiring?" She looked surprised. "You want to work?" I nodded. I'm not ready to just sit at home and wait for the day to end. She studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "We could use someone for mornings. It's not glamorous, but the coffee's free." That was how it began. Not a grand reinvention, not a dramatic transformation, just a small decision that shifted the rhythm of my days. I started the following Monday. The first morning I put on the cafe's plain brown apron, I caught my reflection in the window and almost laughed. I had been a wife, a mother, a caretaker, a scapegoat, but never just a woman behind a counter pouring coffee for strangers. It felt oddly liberating. The work was simple but honest, wiping tables, refilling cups, greeting regulars who didn't care who I used to be. At first, the other employees treated me with the polite detachment people reserve for someone old enough to be their grandmother. But after a few days, they began to include me in their chatter. The youngest, a college student named Marla, called me Miss M. One morning she said, "You've got this calm energy, like nothing rattles you." I wanted to tell her that it's not calmness. It's what happens when you've already been rattled beyond repair. Instead, I just smiled. In the afternoons, when the cafe was quiet, I would sit by the window with my notebook. I started writing small things, not diaries, not confessions, just fragments of thought. I wrote about endurance, about the way silence can both wound and protect, about how love, when it survives long enough, stops being a feeling and becomes a kind of geography. Each word steadied me. The people who came and went didn't know who I was, and I didn't volunteer the information. To them, I was just the woman who remembered how everyone liked their coffee. One evening, as I locked up, the owner handed me my first envelope of wages. It wasn't much, but holding it felt like reclaiming something invisible. For the first time in years, the money in my hand was mine, earned without apology, untouched by inheritance or pity. As I walked home, the sun dipped low, painting the desert gold again. A storm was gathering in the distance, but I wasn't afraid of it. Some storms, I realized, don't come to destroy. They come to clear the air. That winter, the air in Santa Fe turned thin and metallic, the kind that carries sound too far and memory too close. By then, I had worked at the cafe for 3 months. The rhythm of it had settled into me the way tide settles into shore. Early mornings before sunrise, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine, the same old radio station humming low behind the counter. Routine is a strange kind of mercy. It lets you breathe without noticing how empty the air has become. I no longer counted the days since I'd spoken to Claire. I had stopped expecting anything from her except distance, and even that felt generous compared to the years of accusation that had come before. Every morning, when I opened the cafe, I told myself that quiet is its own form of success. But quiet has edges, and sometimes they cut when you least expect it. One Tuesday afternoon in January, the mail came late. I found the envelope waiting on my doorstep when I returned home, a thick white thing with no return address, the handwriting careful and unfamiliar. I opened it over the sink, expecting perhaps another formal notice about the estate, another legal formality disguised as courtesy. Instead, it was a letter from a journalist at a local paper. He wrote that he was working on a human interest piece about family legacies and contested wills, and asked if I would be willing to comment on the recent dispute involving the Lang estate. The phrasing was polite, but unmistakably intrusive. My name had made its way into the world again, reduced to a cautionary anecdote for readers who like to sip coffee and feel superior to other people's misfortunes. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and burned it in the sink. The flame flared blue, then vanished, leaving nothing but a faint smell of ink and dust. The next morning, when I arrived at the cafe, Heather, the owner, was standing by the register with a newspaper in her hand. Her eyes met mine before I saw the headline. "You're in here," she said softly, sliding the paper across the counter. There it was, beneath a photo I didn't remember being taken. Widow at the center of family rift. The article quoted sources close to the family, which meant Claire. It described me as reclusive, difficult, a woman of strong opinions who often clashed with her late husband and daughter. The words were measured but poisoned. There was even a line about how I had insisted on maintaining full control of the estate despite emotional concerns raised by surviving relatives. I stared at the page until the letters blurred. Heather said quietly, "You don't have to explain anything." I nodded, though my throat had closed too tight for words. That afternoon, customers came in with that peculiar politeness people reserve for scandal, smiling a little too brightly, speaking a little too softly, pretending not to recognize me, while clearly trying to remember where they'd seen my face. I kept my head down, wiped tables, poured coffee, and told myself it would pass. Shame has a short attention span when it belongs to someone else. But when I got home that night, I found a voicemail from Claire. Her voice was tight, trembling, the way people sound when they're proud of their cruelty. "I thought you should know the truth is out now. Maybe people will finally see what kind of person you really are." Then a pause, then softer. "You made me this way." For a long time after that, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the red light on the answering machine as if it were a wound that wouldn't clot. I wanted to call her, to ask why the need to punish me never dulled, why every act of my survival felt like betrayal to her. But I knew what she would say. because you never gave enough. That had always been the rule of motherhood. Give everything, and when there's nothing left, apologize for not having more. Instead of calling, I took out a piece of paper and began to write. I didn't know yet what it was, a letter, a confession, a map out of the past. But once the pen touched the page, the words poured out like something broken at last. I wrote that night until the moon had climbed high over the hills, filling the room with that cold, forgiving light that erases detail. I wrote about the years when Richard's silence was heavier than argument, about how Claire had learned early to read moods instead of words, how love in our house had always been a negotiation between fear and duty. I wrote until my hand cramped, until I realized I wasn't writing to her or even to him. I was writing to the part of myself that had been waiting all these years to speak. When I finished, I folded the pages and placed them in an envelope. On the front, I wrote only my name. Then I tucked it inside the drawer with Richard's note and Thomas's letter. For several weeks after that, I lived as though nothing had happened. The cafe returned to its small routines. The gossip in the paper faded into other stories. But something inside me had shifted. It wasn't peace exactly, but a readiness, a sense that I had finally stepped outside the narrow corridor of shame my family had built around me. One morning, as I was polishing the coffee urn, a young man came in, a stranger, tall, with a tired face that carried something familiar. He hesitated near the counter, studying me. "Mrs. Lang?" he asked quietly. His voice was careful, like someone testing ice. It took me a moment to recognize him. "Thomas," I said, and for the first time in years, I smiled without meaning to. He nodded, looking relieved and uneasy all at once. "I hope it's okay that I came. Mom doesn't know." I told him to sit, poured him coffee, and watched his hands tremble slightly as he lifted the cup. He looked older than 18, as if the past months had aged him faster than the seasons. "I saw the article," he said. "It's not fair. She's not seeing things clearly." I said nothing, letting him find his own pace. He glanced around the cafe. "You work here?" I nodded. "I like it," I said. "People expect nothing of me, and that's a relief." He smiled faintly. "You always used to tell me expectations are traps." "I did," I said. "I still believe it." We talked for nearly an hour, small things at first, then deeper. He told me Claire was drinking more, that she spent evenings talking to the ashes as if waiting for them to answer. "She blames you for everything," he said quietly, "but I think she blames herself more." I felt a pang I hadn't allowed myself in months. Guilt and compassion often wear the same face. "She's hurting," I said. "She always has been." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Do you want me to tell her I saw you?" I thought about it. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe someday." After he left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the street shimmer under the noon sun. The conversation had cracked something open inside me. I realized that all these months I'd been living as if I were already buried, like Richard, like the woman in the article, a name attached to an old wound. But Thomas's visit reminded me that memory can still move forward. I went home and took out the envelope I'd written to myself. I read it again, then tore it in half. I didn't need it anymore. The act of writing had already freed me. 2 nights later, around midnight, there was a knock on my door. It was the kind of sound that doesn't startle you immediately, but slowly seeps into your awareness until you realize someone is insisting on entry. I opened the door to find Claire standing there. She looked thinner, brittle around the eyes, her hair pulled back too tight. The sight of her in that doorway, so familiar, so foreign, made my knees weaken. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was flat, stripped of anger, almost mechanical. I stepped aside. She didn't sit. She paced the small living room, glancing at the modest furniture, the tidy shelves, the framed photographs of a life she had tried to erase. "You're living like this?" she said finally, gesturing around. "You could be in the house, Dad's house." I said quietly, "It's my house, technically, but it never felt like home." She stopped pacing, turned to me. "They printed things that weren't true. I didn't mean for it to get that far." I wanted to believe her, but her eyes betrayed calculation. "What did you mean then?" I asked. "I just wanted people to understand what he went through," she said, the practiced phrasing of someone defending an old script. "He deserved respect." "He has it," I said. "He's beyond harm now." She flinched as if the words had slapped her. "You always talk like that," she said. "So calm, so superior. Do you even feel anything?" I looked at her, at the hollow in her cheeks, the trembling of her hands. "Too much," I said. "I just learned to keep it quiet." For a moment, something like recognition flickered in her expression. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She placed it on the table. "I brought these," she said. I knew before she opened it what it was, the ashes. She loosened the drawstring, revealing the dull silver urn inside. "I don't want them anymore," she said. "They don't give me peace." I stood there, the weight of years pressing against my ribs. "You can keep them," I said gently. "I don't need them either." But she shook her head. "No, you take them. You won, remember?" The bitterness in her voice cracked mid-sentence, breaking into something raw. "He loved you more," she whispered, "even after everything." I reached out, but she stepped back. "Don't," she said. "If you touch me, I'll break." We stood in silence until she set the pouch on the table and turned to leave. At the door, she hesitated. "I'm sorry for the article," she said. "It's easier to hate you than to miss him." Then she was gone. The house felt impossibly still after she left. I didn't open the pouch right away. I sat beside it, staring at the soft fabric, thinking of all the ways people tried to contain the uncontainable. Love, grief, blame, the ashes of what used to be alive. Around dawn, I finally opened it. The urn was small, cold, surprisingly heavy. I ran my fingers over the engraved initials, R.E.L., and thought of the last line he wrote to me. "You stayed even when I disappeared." Maybe that was why he left everything to me, not out of affection, but acknowledgement. The kind of acknowledgement that frightens those who never learned endurance. That morning, I took the urn to the cafe before opening hours. I set it on the counter while I brewed coffee. The rising steam fogged the metal until it looked almost alive. When Heather arrived, she stared at it without question. "Is that him?" she asked. I nodded. "He was a difficult man," she said, "but he gave you something in the end." "Yes," I said, "a burden and a gift wrapped in the same paper." She smiled faintly. "That's usually what love looks like." For the next few days, I kept the urn in my kitchen, not out of sentiment, but to remind myself that endings can be visible. Claire didn't call again, though I heard from Thomas once. He wrote that she had checked herself into a retreat, to rest. I didn't ask for details. I just wrote back, "Tell her the ashes are safe, and so am I." When I sealed the envelope, I realized it was the first time in years I'd used the word safe without irony. On a Sunday evening, as the sun bled red over the hills, I carried the urn to the arroyo behind the house. The wind was gentle, the air smelling faintly of pine. I unscrewed the lid and let the ashes pour slowly, not into a grave, not into a river, just onto the open earth where wind could decide what to do with them. They scattered easily, a gray shimmer against the fading light. I whispered, "You're free, Richard, and so am I." When I turned back toward the house, the first stars had begun to appear. I felt the smallest, strangest smile rise in me, not of triumph, but of release. Life, it seemed, had finally stopped waiting for permission to continue. The morning after I scattered Richard's ashes, I woke with a strange stillness in my chest, as though something inside me had been quietly rearranged during the night. The house was filled with that tender, almost weightless silence that comes only after something irrevocable has been done. I sat up in bed, half expecting to feel remorse or loneliness or even fear of what might come next, but instead there was only an unfamiliar clarity. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was a kind of gravity turned inward, a steadying. I made coffee and took it out to the small porch, where the early light slid across the red earth like melted copper. The air smelled faintly of sage. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what needed to be mended or forgiven. I was simply thinking. Yet the peace that had settled over me was fragile, and I knew it wouldn't last unchallenged. Claire's silence had stretched for weeks since that night she left the ashes. I had learned that her quiet wasn't withdrawal. It was the gathering of energy for another confrontation. I could almost feel her in the distance, pacing through her house, rehearsing accusations, rewriting the story again. Still, I didn't reach out. I'd come to understand that there are wars best ended not with surrender or victory, but with absence. To engage again would mean returning to the old rhythm of guilt and defense, a dance I no longer had the strength to repeat. At the cafe, life went on as though nothing had changed. The regulars came and went. The same tired jokes were told. The same songs played softly from the radio. But the small world of that place had started to feel different to me. I had begun to see each of those faces, the man who read the paper for hours, the young couple who shared one pastry instead of two, the quiet woman who always came just before closing, as small proofs of endurance. Everyone in that cafe was holding some private grief, some quiet compromise with life, yet they all carried it with a kind of unspoken dignity. It was there, in those ordinary mornings, that I realized survival itself could be a kind of art. About a month later, a letter arrived from Claire. It was short, no more than a few lines written in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. "I'm in Tucson for treatment. Don't worry. Thomas knows where I am. I don't expect you to answer." That was all. There was no apology, no tenderness, only a kind of weary resignation. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it beside Richard's old letter in the drawer. For a moment I thought of writing back, something small, perhaps just, "I hope you find peace." But I didn't. Words can become a kind of chain when silence is finally learning to breathe. Instead, I lit a candle and left it burning until it died out on its own. It felt like a prayer that didn't need language. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. Routine can comfort, but it can also dull. I found myself one evening standing in the middle of the living room, looking at the bare walls and the soft, washed-out colors of the old furniture, realizing I had begun to live like a visitor in my own life. The inheritance still sat mostly untouched in the bank. I had told myself I didn't care about money, that it meant nothing compared to peace, but the truth is that the money wasn't the point. It was what it represented. For decades, I had made myself small, cautious, grateful for crumbs of affection. That inheritance, in its cold legal form, was the first tangible proof that my existence had weight. I decided quite suddenly that I would use it, not to buy things, but to create something that would outlive the story that had been told about me. It began as a modest idea. The cafe had a small back room that wasn't being used, a dusty space filled with boxes of old menus and unused chairs. I asked Heather if I could rent it for a few hours each week. She looked at me curiously. "What for?" she asked. "For women," I said. "Older ones, those who don't have anyone to talk to." She smiled, a little unsure but supportive. "You mean like a group?" "No," I said. "More like a place to sit and be seen." And so, on Thursdays after the morning rush, I started opening that room. I brought my own teapot, a few secondhand armchairs I found at the thrift store, and a small speaker that played soft music. At first, no one came. Then one woman did, a retired nurse named Gloria, who lived alone and had been widowed 20 years earlier. She came every week after that, always bringing a small bundle of lavender from her garden. Then another woman came, then 2 more. Soon there were 6 of us, sitting in that room once a week, drinking tea and talking, not about our pain exactly, but about the texture of our days, about small indignities, lost friends, forgotten dreams. There was laughter sometimes, long silences other times, but there was always understanding. We didn't fix anything. We simply witnessed each other. It was during one of those gatherings that I realized what the true climax of my life had become. Not the scattering of ashes, not the inheritance, not even the reconciliation that never came. It was this, the quiet act of creating a space where women like me could exist without justification. I watched them, Gloria with her delicate hands, Jean with her faded lipstick and sharp humor, Marta with her soft tremor and endless gentleness. And I thought, this is what legacy looks like, not what is left in a will, but what is left in other people's hands when you've finished being afraid. Word spread slowly. More women began to come. Some brought books, others photographs. A few came only to listen. We called it the Thursday Room, though no one ever wrote the name down. It was never advertised. It was passed from one mouth to another, from one need to another. Sometimes I caught myself wondering what Richard would have thought, whether he would have mocked it or quietly admired it. Perhaps both. He had always been torn between disdain and awe for the parts of me that refused to bend. Then one afternoon, as I was closing the cafe, a woman walked in. She was younger than the others, maybe in her 40s, wearing a raincoat, though there was no rain. She hesitated by the door before speaking. "Are you Mrs. Lang?" I nodded. "I'm a social worker at the retreat in Tucson," she said gently. My heart clenched. "Is it my daughter?" She nodded. "She's all right," she said quickly. "She's stable. She just wanted me to deliver something." From her bag, she took out an envelope, sealed and neatly folded, and placed it on the counter. She said you'd know what to do with it. After she left, I stood there for a long time, the envelope heavy in my hand. I didn't open it immediately. I cleaned the counters, locked the doors, turned off the lights. Only when I was home, sitting at the kitchen table, did I finally break the seal. Inside was a single page, Claire's handwriting, uneven, as though written in haste or exhaustion. "Mom, I found the picture of you and Dad at the lake, the one where you're laughing. I never noticed before that he was looking at you, not the camera. I think he did love you, just badly. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I understand now. I hope you're not alone." There were no grand words, no apology, but it was enough. I sat there reading it over and over until the tears came. Not heavy sobs, but quiet, grateful tears that felt like rain after a drought. I didn't need her forgiveness. I just needed her understanding, and for the first time, it was there, fragile and real. I placed the letter with the others, the drawer now a small archive of everything that had broken and healed us. That night, I dreamed of the lake in the photograph. The water was calm, the air thick with summer. Richard was standing on the dock, and Claire was a child again, holding a red bucket, calling for me to look. When I turned, they were both there, not angry, not distant, just waiting. I woke before dawn, the dream still lingering like the scent of wet wood. I went outside, barefoot, and stood under the stars. They were so bright they almost looked close enough to touch. For years I had believed that love was something given and taken by others, but in that moment I understood it as something we build ourselves, from the ruins if we must, out of silence if we have to. When the sun rose, I packed a small box. Inside, I placed Richard's letter, Claire's note, and the photograph she had mentioned, which I found tucked inside an old album. I took them to the Thursday room and placed the box on the shelf. When the women asked what it was, I said, "A record of what we survive." They nodded, each understanding in her own way. And for the first time, I felt what I had been chasing all along. Not vindication, not victory, but peace shaped by my own hands. Spring arrived slowly that year, almost reluctantly, as though even the season had grown tired of beginnings. The air in Santa Fe softened, the wind turned warmer, and the light took on that gentle, forgiving hue that makes old things look less lonely. I had begun to notice details again, the smell of wet earth after dawn, the way dust rose in golden swirls when the first cars passed the road outside my house, the low hum of bees near the rosemary bushes I thought were long dead. After so many months of stillness, these small signs of life felt like a conversation I had been waiting decades to resume. I woke earlier, without the ache that used to greet me at the edges of consciousness. The mornings were no longer heavy with dread. They were simply mornings. I would sit on the porch with my cup of coffee and listen to the sound of the town waking, dogs barking, screen doors slamming, the distant bell of the church that had forgotten my name. It was in that ordinariness, I think, that the real healing began. The Thursday room continued quietly. The women came and went, some new, some returning, each carrying her own quiet weight. We had stopped needing to talk about grief directly. It had become a background note, understood without words. Instead, we spoke of practical things, recipes, books, small errands, the stubbornness of bodies that no longer obeyed without protest. There was laughter sometimes, gentle and low, the kind that doesn't disturb the air. One afternoon, Gloria brought her granddaughter, a shy girl of 16 who hovered at the door, unsure whether she was intruding. I poured her tea and told her she was exactly where she should be. She sat between us, listening, not saying much, but I saw something soften in her face as she realized that aging isn't only loss. It's also a slow revealing. Watching her, I understood that this was the true inheritance I wanted to leave behind. Not money, not houses, not ashes, but a place where women could exist without apology for the years written on their skin. Sometimes I thought about Claire, not with bitterness, but with a kind of distant affection, the way you think of someone you once knew intimately, but can no longer picture clearly. She wrote occasionally from Tucson, short notes, factual, polite. She was taking classes in counseling, she said, trying to help people who don't know how to talk. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She mentioned Thomas now and then, that he was studying engineering, that he came to visit her on weekends. She never spoke of her father anymore. There was no need to. I kept her letters in the same drawer with the rest, a small family of words that no longer wounded. Each one felt lighter than the last, as if the distance between us had become breathable at last. One evening, after the cafe closed, I stayed behind to clean. The windows were open, and the air smelled of rain. I was wiping the counter when I saw Thomas standing outside, taller now, older in the way young people age suddenly when they find their direction. He waved and came in. "Mom asked me to give you this," he said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of her standing by a lake, her hair loose, her smile unguarded. On the back she had written, "I remember now that you were always there." It was the simplest line, yet it felt like a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was still closed. I thanked him, and he stayed for coffee. We talked easily, about his studies, about his plans, about nothing important at all. When he left, I realized that the anger that had shadowed our family for so long had finally lost its appetite. The next morning, I framed the photograph and placed it on the shelf in the Thursday room, beside the box that held Richard's letter and hers. It felt right, as though the circle had quietly closed without ceremony. When the other women arrived, they noticed it but didn't ask. Some stories, once healed, no longer require retelling. We made tea and watched the light move slowly across the walls, our silences companionable, our breaths steady. As summer drew closer, I began to think about leaving Santa Fe, not escaping, just moving, as living things are meant to move. The house had grown too large for one person, and the desert, though beautiful, held too many echoes. I found a small cottage near Taos, surrounded by pines, and far enough from town that the nights would be dark and full of stars. I told Heather I was leaving the cafe. She hugged me longer than I expected. "You'll come back to visit?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "But if I don't, that's all right too. Goodbyes don't frighten me anymore. They're just another form of punctuation." On my last evening in the old house, I walked to the arroyo where I had scattered Richard's ashes. The ground was covered with wildflowers now, stubborn splashes of yellow and violet that grew where there had once been only dust. I stood there for a while, feeling the wind on my face, and thought of all the versions of myself that had lived and disappeared on this same piece of earth. The young bride who believed endurance was love, the middle-aged woman who mistook silence for strength, the widow who thought loneliness was punishment. They were all still here, folded into the soil, forgiven. I whispered a thank you to each of them, then turned back toward home. Before leaving for good, I wrote one last letter to Claire. I didn't overthink it. I told her the truth in plain words, that I had found peace, that forgiveness had come not as a grand revelation, but as a quiet fading of need. I told her that her father had taught me patience, that she had taught me endurance, and that both had finally turned into freedom. I ended with a sentence I hadn't known I was capable of writing. "You don't owe me love, only honesty, and I believe you found that now." I mailed it the next morning and felt nothing but calm. When I arrived in Taos a week later, the cottage was smaller than I had imagined, its paint peeling, its garden overgrown. But it was perfect. The first night I slept there, I left the windows open. The air smelled of pine resin and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once, then again, and the sound didn't frighten me. I thought of Richard, of Claire, of the life I had carried like a fragile dish for so many years, and I realized I was finally able to set it down. not because I had stopped caring, but because caring no longer hurt. Now, when I wake, the first thing I hear is the wind moving through the trees, and sometimes I imagine it's the sound of all our stories mingling, the ones spoken, the ones silenced, the ones still being written by women who have learned that surviving is not the same as waiting. I walk to the market, I talk to the neighbors, I grow herbs again. I have become ordinary, and it is a relief. If someone asks about my family, I tell them what matters, that I have a daughter who is finding her way, a grandson who visits when he can, and a husband who taught me, in his own flawed way, what it means to stay. I suppose that is how all stories end, not with resolution, but with rhythm restored. There are days when the loneliness returns like an old visitor, but it no longer frightens me. It just sits beside me quietly until it leaves. In the evenings, I light a candle on the porch and watch the mountains fade into dusk. Sometimes I think of other women, those still trapped in the rooms I once inhabited, silent, unseen, believing they have no right to begin again. If any of them could hear me, I would tell them this: the world may forget you, but you are not required to forget yourself. Start small, open a window, breathe. That is how freedom begins, with one quiet act of belonging to yourself again. And if they listened closely, they would hear, carried softly on the wind, the voice of an old woman who has finally learned to speak her own peace.